Welcome to Thoughtful Depths. Today, we're examining the current United States government shutdown through a lens that might surprise you. The political philosophy of Niccolò Machiavelli, the 16th century Florentine diplomat whose name has become synonymous with cunning statecraft. When we think of government shutdowns, we often frame them in terms of moral failure, partisan gridlock, or democratic dysfunction. But what would Machiavelli, the author of The Prince, say about this phenomenon? Would he see it as weakness, or as a calculated demonstration of power, as chaos, or as strategic maneuvering? Before we dive in, let me be clear. Examining this situation through Machiavelli's eyes doesn't mean endorsing his conclusions. Rather, it means stripping away the rhetoric and asking uncomfortable questions about power, leverage, and the nature of political conflict in a constitutional republic. Machiavelli was, above all, a realist. He didn't write about how princes should behave in an ideal world, but how they must behave in the world as it actually exists. So let's set aside our partisan preferences for the next 20 minutes and think like Machiavelli. Let's examine the shutdown, not as citizens hoping for the best in our leaders, but as cold-eyed observers of political power in action. Machiavelli would immediately recognize a government shutdown for what it truly is, a weapon, not a failure of the system, but a feature of it. In The Prince, Machiavelli writes extensively about the tools available to rulers, and he would have understood that in a system of divided powers, the ability to withhold consent, to refuse cooperation, is itself a form of power. Think about what a shutdown actually represents. It's not simply legislators failing to agree. It's one faction saying to another, "We would rather see the machinery of government grind to a halt than concede to your demands." This is, in Machiavellian terms, a demonstration of virtù, that quality of decisive action and willingness to do what must be done, regardless of conventional niceties. Machiavelli advised princes that they must be willing to be not good when necessity commands. A government shutdown is precisely this kind of moment. Its leaders saying, "We are willing to endure the criticism, the public anger, the real human consequences, because we believe our political objectives are more important." This is ruthlessly pragmatic thinking that Machiavelli would recognize instantly. But here's where it gets interesting from a Machiavellian perspective. Is this weapon being wielded effectively? Because Machiavelli didn't just advocate for ruthlessness, he advocated for successful ruthlessness. A prince who acts boldly but fails has not demonstrated virtù, merely recklessness. The question isn't whether you're willing to use extreme measures, but whether those measures achieve your objectives. And this is where we must ask, what exactly are the objectives? Is the goal to force policy concessions, to demonstrate strength to one's political base, to weaken political opponents in the eyes of the public? Each of these goals requires different tactics, and Machiavelli would insist that clarity of purpose must precede action. One of Machiavelli's key insights was that rulers must understand the nature of fortune, which he often personified as a river that can be channeled but never fully controlled. A shutdown is an attempt to channel the river of political fortune, to create a crisis that forces others to yield. But if the crisis spins out of control, if the public turns against you more than against your opponents, then you haven't mastered fortune. You've been swept away by it. Perhaps Machiavelli's most famous advice is that it is better for a prince to be feared than loved if he cannot be both. But he adds a crucial caveat: a prince must avoid being hated. This distinction is essential to understanding how a Machiavellian analysis views the shutdown. Fear in Machiavelli's framework means respect for your power and willingness to use it. It means your opponents know you will follow through on your threats. Love means genuine affection and loyalty from the people. Hatred means active opposition that undermines your ability to govern. So where does a government shutdown fall on this spectrum? From a Machiavellian perspective, a shutdown could demonstrate fear-inducing resolve. It shows you mean business, that you're not bluffing when you say certain principles are non-negotiable. Your political opponents may not like you, but they understand you're serious. This can be politically valuable. However, and this is critical, a shutdown risks crossing from fear into hatred. When federal workers miss paychecks, when national parks close, when essential services are disrupted, the public doesn't just fear political leaders, they begin to hate them. They see their own lives disrupted by what appears to be political game-playing, and this breeds the kind of contempt that Machiavelli warned against. Machiavelli wrote that cruelty, if it must be used, should be applied swiftly and completely, then followed by benefits to the people. In other words, if you're going to hurt people, do it quickly, decisively, and then immediately pivot to making their lives better so they focus on the benefits rather than the pain. A prolonged shutdown violates this principle. It sustained, ongoing harm without clear resolution or immediate benefit. It's the political equivalent of slow torture rather than swift execution. Machiavelli would likely see this as the worst possible use of harsh measures. All the costs, none of the strategic benefits. Moreover, Machiavelli understood that perception matters enormously. If the public perceives you as causing unnecessary suffering for purely selfish or factional reasons, you lose legitimacy. And without legitimacy, raw power becomes much harder to exercise effectively. Here's where Machiavelli's analysis gets truly interesting. The United States isn't a princedom. It's a constitutional republic with deliberately divided powers. So how would Machiavelli analyze political conflict in a system specifically designed to prevent any single leader or faction from accumulating too much power? In The Prince, Machiavelli actually discusses different types of states and the challenges each presents. He would likely classify our system as a mixed government, incorporating elements of monarchy, the presidency, aristocracy, the Senate, and democracy, the House of Representatives. The founders deliberately created a system where power would check power, where conflict was not a bug, but a feature. From this perspective, shutdowns are inevitable. They're the natural result of giving different institutions the power to block each other. Machiavelli would understand this immediately. He lived in Renaissance Italy, where city-states and factions constantly maneuvered against each other. He knew that where power is divided, conflict is constant. But here's Machiavelli's crucial insight. In such systems, successful leaders must be skilled at maintaining and expanding their coalitions. They must understand which allies are reliable and which are fair-weather friends. They must know when to compromise and when to stand firm. They must be able to read the political terrain accurately. A government shutdown represents a collapse of coalition management. It means that the normal processes of negotiation, compromise, and deal-making have failed. From a Machiavellian standpoint, this raises questions. Did leaders accurately assess their own strength? Did they understand their opponent's positions? Did they have a realistic theory of victory? Machiavelli was deeply skeptical of leaders who mistook stubbornness for strength or who failed to adapt their tactics to changing circumstances. He praised flexibility and cunning over rigid adherence to principle. A leader who repeatedly uses the same tactic, regardless of whether it's working, is not demonstrating virtue, but folly. This suggests a Machiavellian critique of shutdowns. If they don't achieve their objectives, if they don't force the concessions you're seeking, then continuing them is not principled leadership. It's simply poor strategy. It's fighting yesterday's battle with yesterday's tactics while the political landscape shifts beneath your feet. Furthermore, Machiavelli understood that in systems with multiple power centers, reputation for competence matters enormously. If you're seen as unable to govern effectively, as presiding over chaos rather than order, other power centers will be less likely to cooperate with you in the future. You lose the ability to credibly threaten or promise. And in politics, credibility is currency. Machiavelli wrote extensively about a prince's relationship with the people, and his advice here is nuanced in ways that simple summaries often miss. While he's famous for saying it's better to be feared than loved, he also insisted that a prince needs the people's support, or at least their acquiescence, to maintain power. In a modern democracy, this dynamic is even more pronounced. Leaders derive their legitimacy from elections, from the consent of the governed. So how does a government shutdown affect this crucial relationship? Machiavelli would likely analyze this through the lens of what he called effectual truth versus imagined republics. He dismissed philosophers who wrote about how leaders should behave in ideal circumstances, preferring to focus on how they must behave in reality. The effectual truth of a shutdown is this: the public cares about who they blame. If the public primarily blames your opponents for the shutdown, you're in a strong position. You've successfully framed the narrative, convinced people that the other side's unreasonableness is the problem. This can actually strengthen your political position, demonstrating both your resolve and your opponent's intransigence. But if the public blames you, if they see you as the obstacle to normal governance, then you're in serious trouble. Machiavelli was clear that a prince who loses popular support faces extreme danger. In a democratic system, that danger manifests as electoral defeat, loss of political capital, and diminished ability to govern even if you retain formal power. This is why Machiavelli would insist on careful attention to public opinion during a shutdown. It's not about whether you're morally right or whether your policy positions are sound. It's about whether you're winning the political battle for public perception. If you're not, then from a Machiavellian perspective, you need to change tactics immediately. Machiavelli also understood the concept of political theater. He knew that appearances often matter more than reality, that perception shapes political outcomes. A government shutdown is high-stakes political theater. Every statement, every photo opportunity, every human interest story about workers missing paychecks shapes how the public understands who is responsible and what the fight is really about. The skillful Machiavellian leader would be deeply attentive to these theatrical elements. They would frame the shutdown in terms that resonate with public values and concerns. They would ensure that their own supporters remain energized while peeling off marginal supporters from the opposition. They would look for opportunities to appear reasonable while painting opponents as extreme. Conversely, a leader who ignores these theatrical elements, who simply assumes that having the right policy position is enough, is failing to understand how political power actually works. Machiavelli would see this as dangerous naivety, the kind of thinking that leads to political destruction. One of Machiavelli's most important but least discussed pieces of advice concerns knowing when to press an advantage and when to cut your losses. A prince must be able to read the political situation accurately and adapt accordingly. Stubbornness in the face of changing circumstances is not strength, but foolishness. This brings us to perhaps the most Machiavellian question about any government shutdown. What's the exit strategy? Machiavelli would insist that before you deploy a dramatic tactic like a shutdown, you must have a clear theory of victory. How exactly does this shutdown end in a way that advances your political objectives? What are your opponent's incentives to cave? What's your plan if they don't? How long can you sustain this without the costs outweighing the benefits? A shutdown without an exit strategy is like a siege without sufficient supplies. You may have trapped your enemy, but if you run out of food first, you're the one who loses. Machiavelli wrote extensively about military strategy, and he understood that you must always maintain your lines of retreat, always have a way out if things go badly. From this perspective, we can ask some hard questions about any prolonged shutdown. Did those who initiated it have a realistic path to victory? Did they accurately assess their leverage? Did they understand their opponent's tolerance for pain and their own base's tolerance for disruption? If the answer to any of these questions is no, then the shutdown represents not bold leadership, but strategic incompetence. It's the political equivalent of starting a war without understanding how wars end. Machiavelli would also point out that how you end a shutdown matters enormously for your future political standing. If you can declare some kind of victory, extract even symbolic concessions, you can frame the shutdown as successful brinkmanship. Your supporters see you as a fighter who won't back down. Your opponents know you're willing to use extreme tactics, but if you simply capitulate, if you reopen the government without achieving anything substantial, you've demonstrated weakness. You've shown that your threats are hollow, that you'll blink first in a standoff. This dramatically reduces your leverage in future negotiations. Your opponents know they can simply wait you out. This is why Machiavelli would insist on careful attention to face-saving measures, to ways of ending the crisis that allow both sides to claim some measure of victory. Politics isn't just about raw power, it's about the appearance of power, the reputation for strength or weakness that shapes all future interactions. So, what have we learned by examining the government shutdown through Machiavelli's eyes? We've seen that a shutdown can be understood as a weapon, a tool of political leverage in a system of divided powers. We've explored how it relates to the dynamics of fear versus love and the crucial importance of avoiding hatred. We've considered how constitutional design shapes political conflict and why coalition management matters so much. We've examined the central role of public opinion and political theater, and we've discussed the critical importance of exit strategies and understanding when to advance versus when to retreat. But here's what we must remember. Machiavelli offers us an analytical framework, not a moral one. He helps us understand how power works, but he doesn't tell us whether the pursuit of power is worthwhile or whether particular political goals justify the means used to achieve them. Looking at the shutdown through Machiavelli's eyes reveals the strategic calculations at play, the games of leverage and perception. But it doesn't answer the questions that matter most to us as citizens. Is this serving the common good? Are our leaders prioritizing the welfare of ordinary people? Is this how we want our democracy to function? Machiavelli's great contribution was forcing us to see politics as it is, not as we wish it to be. He insisted that we look squarely at the role of power, conflict, and strategic calculation in governance. This is valuable because understanding how power works is essential to holding it accountable. But Machiavelli's great limitation was his refusal to seriously engage with questions of justice, morality, and the common good except as tools of political manipulation. He treated these as props in the theater of power, rather than as genuine ends worthy of pursuit. As we think about the shutdown, we need both perspectives. We need Machiavelli's hard-nosed realism about political incentives and power dynamics, but we also need to ask whether the system is working as it should, whether our leaders are serving us well, whether there are better ways to resolve political differences than through these recurring crises. The most sophisticated political thinking combines Machiavellian realism about how power works with serious moral reflection about how power should be used. We should understand the game being played, but we should also ask whether it's a game worth playing and whether there are better rules we could adopt. That's where I'll leave you today. Next time your leaders explain their actions during a shutdown, listen for both levels, the stated justifications and the underlying power calculations. Understand the Machiavellian game being played, but don't let that understanding stop you from demanding something better. Thanks for joining me on this journey into thoughtful depths. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe and share. And let me know in the comments. Do you think Machiavelli's framework helps us understand modern political crises, or does it miss something essential? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep thinking deeply.